In this brief video, I want to look at some history on the British Empire that will help you to understand the literature we're going to read in the next 2 weeks, and also some terms from postcolonial theory that will help you to analyze that literature. Joseph Conrad famously wrote in his novel Heart of Darkness, "The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much." And so, talking about the British Empire, we are looking at some deeds and some attitudes that today we find repugnant, or at least I hope we do. Why create an empire? Many historians believe that the British didn't intend to create an empire in the same way that other European powers may have tried to do. Instead, it wasn't particularly desire for land that the British were after when they went out sailing in the late 16th century, the 1580s. It was a desire for trade. Other European powers like the Dutch and the Spanish were already trading with far parts of the world for valuable commodities that the British had no access to, and so their desire was to get a piece of that pie. Why did the British succeed? And really, this doesn't apply just to the British, but to all European colonial powers. Jared Diamond, in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel, postulates it was because of guns, germs, and steel. The British and other Europeans had guns. The indigenous people did not. Unfortunately, the British and other Europeans also brought European diseases such as smallpox and measles, which were devastating to native populations where those two diseases were not known at all. The other factor is that while other cultures may have had cannons, they did not have weapons made of steel, which made the weapons much more durable. Brief timeline of the British Empire so you get an idea of what was happening when. Again, in the 1580s, the British were envious of the Spanish, and they sent out their traders to try to get a piece of the action. Elizabeth I actually authorized Sir Walter Raleigh and other privateers to rob Spanish treasure ships. The British were not looking to settle down at this time. The East India Company was a group of people who pooled their resources in order to pay for voyages to get lucrative cargoes from the East back to Europe, to England. And so that the risk was shared by a larger group. If something went wrong, you'd have less liability. So that led to the formation of joint stock companies, hence all these companies. The East India Company, the Virginia Company settling in North America. Barbados was not a company, it was individual investors staking out sugar plantations. Again, the biggest product that the East India Company brought back was tea from India and China. And in order to sweeten the tea, sugar was needed. The British found that the islands in the Caribbean were perfect for raising sugar, and so they started to plant sugar plantations on many islands in the Caribbean. The South Sea Company in 1711. Captain Cook explored the whole Pacific in the 1770s. The Cape of Good Hope at the tip of Africa in the early 1800s. And then West African colonies such as Ghana and Nigeria were places where freed slaves were returned in the 1820s and 30s. In the 1850s, Africa was the last place that the British tried to trade with, largely because the diseases in Africa had the same effect on Europeans that European diseases had on indigenous people in the Americas. And Europeans got to Africa and died left and right. David Livingstone pioneered the idea of commerce and Christianity. Yes, we want to trade with these people, but we need to give them something in return, Christianity. And this was, in fact, a very, we see this at work in the poem you'll read this week, The White Man's Burden. What can we give people in return for trading with them? Again, you assume a trading relationship is going to be somewhat equal, but in this case, the missionaries hoped to give something that was far more valuable than simply money for goods received. In Southern Africa became much more important in the 1880s and 90s when gold and diamonds were discovered. And this is important in the story Trooper Peter Halkett of Mashonaland, because he was part of the private army of Cecil Rhodes, who single-handedly, he was the director of the company. It wasn't particularly a joint stock company, I don't think. It was Cecil Rhodes' concern, and he sent his private army into what is now Zimbabwe, called it Rhodesia, and took control of the diamond mines. So, post-colonial criticism, how are we going to look at the literature we're going to be reading this week? Here are some important terms that we'll discuss. Orientalism conjures up pictures of the East, strange places, interesting people, languages we don't know. And Edward Said, the great post-colonial critic, who really founded the study in many ways, he's not the only one who studied this, but I think it's fair to say he popularized the study of how Europeans viewed the East, first the Middle East, and then India and China and other points east. He points out that the Europeans learned what was important in these cultures and then used that knowledge to control the members of the culture, the Aborigines. Another important another important aspect that you should analyze is ethnocentrism. Where in the literature that we're going to read does a concern that one's own culture is better than the cultures one is working among? Where does that come up? It comes up frequently in every text. It is very clear that the British felt their culture was superior. And here we see in this picture the British officer riding a horse where all the Indians are standing around watching. Othering, a term coined by Gayatri Spivak, another post-colonial scholar, and I draw your attention to the picture on the left, the two little black boys and the little white girl in her white dress and her white hat. The contrast, a study in black and white. And certainly just the fact that in European culture, black is a negative and white is a positive, has a positive connotation, is enough to give you an idea of what is meant by othering. We are good, they are not. We find lots of ways that authors say that. I think it is also true that each, all the authors we still study have a point at which they realize that they are doing this, and that and they realize that it's doing a disservice to the people around them. Mimicry refers to the behavior of colonized peoples. A black or brown person behaving as though white. They may have gone to school in England. Lots of rich Indians sent their children to Britain to school. An example of that would be Mahatma Gandhi's parents sent him to Britain to go to law school. But almost always the British who see these indigenous people trying to act European make fun of them and feel that they are they're doing it badly. They can't really be European. They're just not good enough, or they're just kind of childish and stupid. Um, Homi Bhabha points out that in fact this aspect of culture, this idea of mimicry, the fact that Native peoples want to mimic something in Western culture suggests that there's something funky about that, something that is not good. And lots of times things that are mimicked are simply that there is an element of parody there. Hybridity, on the other hand, is the blending of cultures to create a new culture. That sounds pretty positive, but in fact, it's not simple cultural blending. There's always a power dynamic of the colonizer over the top of the indigenous people. This may affect language, culture, religion, or politics, or all of those. Here's an example. This is an Indian McDonald's ad, and this is like doubly hybrid. It's McDonald's made for Indian tastes, but they've taken Korean flavors, and this is the Korean range. And of course, because most Indians are Hindu, they don't eat meat. They certainly don't eat beef. They might eat chicken. But here we have paneer, which is cheese, and makalu tiki, which is also cheese, I think. These favorites that certainly are not beef. Here's an example of, whoops, let's go back. Here's an example of a religious article shop, and here we have Jesus and Mary along with Santa Muerte, this figure of death, holy death, this figure from Mexican culture, really Aztec culture. Again, a celebration of the Day of the Dead is really, although it's linked to a Christian holiday, it's really an Aztec tradition. And so we see the melding of something that is an indigenous religion linked to the religion of the colonizers. It would be wrong to assume that Native peoples didn't resist colonization. Of course they did. And over here we see the Indians, the tall Indians and the tall English and the short Indians shaking hands. And again, coming out of the literature of imperialism, there's the elephant, are all of these freedom fighters who are angry about the colonization of India. I would posit that, in fact, the return of Muslim women to wearing the veil or a hijab is really connected to resistance, the idea of Western values. I am not saying that I think all Muslim women want to wear the veil. I think that is imposed by Muslim culture, which is dominated by men. But the fact that there's a desire to have women return to the veil, even though Western culture does not have women dressed that way, I see that as an act of resistance, even if women don't want to do that. It's an act of resistance on the part of Muslim leaders. Finally, the last term we'll look at is that of double consciousness, which is an awareness of how the culture of the colonizer sees one while also living as a member of one's own culture. And this is from the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. I hope you will watch the video there and we'll talk more